Tonight's story is titled, It Happened on the Brooklyn Subway by Paul Deutschman. It Happened on the Brooklyn Subway by Paul Deutschman. God's incredible choreography, it never ceases to amaze. Marcel Sternberger was a methodical man of nearly 50, with bushy white hair, guileless brown eyes, and the bouncing enthusiasm of a Czarist dancer of his native Hungary. He always took the 909 Long Island Railroad train from his suburban home to Woodside, where he caught a subway into the city. On the morning of January 10th, 1948, he boarded the 909 as usual. En route, he suddenly decided to visit Laszlo Victor, a Hungarian friend who lived in Brooklyn and who was ill. I don't know why I decided to go to see him that morning, Sternberger told me some weeks afterward. I could have done it after office hours, but I kept thinking that he could stand a little cheering up. Accordingly, at Ozone Park, Sternberger changed to the subway for Brooklyn, went to his friend's house, and stayed until mid-afternoon. He then boarded a Manhattan-bound subway for his Fifth Avenue office. The car was crowded, Sternberger told me, and there seemed to be no chance of a seat, but just as I entered, a man sitting by the door suddenly jumped up to leave, and I slipped into the empty place. I've been living in New York long enough not to start conversations with strangers, but being a photographer, I have the peculiar habit of analyzing people's faces, and I was struck by the features of the passengers on my left. He was probably in his late 30s, and his eyes seemed to have a hurt expression in them. He was reading a Hungarian-language newspaper, and something prompted me to turn to him and say in Hungarian, "I hope you don't mind if I glance at your paper." The man seemed surprised to be addressed in his native language, but he answered politely, "You may read it now. I'll have time later on." During the half-hour ride to town, we had quite a conversation. He said his name was Paskin. A law student when the war started, he had been put into a labor battalion and sent to the Ukraine. Later, he was captured by the Russians and put to work burying the German dead. After the war, he covered hundreds of miles on foot until he reached his home in Debrecen, a large city in eastern Hungary. I myself knew Debrecen quite well, and we talked about it for a while. Then he told me the rest of his story. When he went to the apartment once occupied by his father, mother, brothers, and sisters, he found strangers living there. Then he went upstairs to the apartment he and his wife had once had. It also was occupied by strangers. None of them had ever heard of his family. As he was leaving, full of sadness, a boy ran after him calling, "Paskin Bashi! Paskin Bashi!" That means Uncle Pashkin. The child was the son of some old neighbors of his. He went to the boy's home and talked to his parents. "Your whole family is dead," they told him. "The Nazis took them, and your wife, to Auschwitz." Auschwitz was one of the worst Nazi concentration camps. Paskin gave up all hope. A few days later, too heartsick to remain any longer in Hungary, which to him was a funeral land, he set out again on foot, stealing across border after border until he reached Paris. He had managed to emigrate to the United States in October 1947, just 3 months before I met him. All the time he had been talking, I kept thinking that somehow his story seemed familiar. A young woman whom I had met recently at the home of friends had also been from Debrecen. She had been sent to Auschwitz. From there she had been transferred to work in a German munitions factory. Her relatives had been killed in the gas chambers. Later, she was liberated by the Americans and was brought here in the first boatload of displaced persons in 1946. Her story had moved me so much that I had written down her address and phone number, intending to invite her to meet my family and thus help relieve the terrible emptiness in her life. It seemed impossible that there could be any connection between these two people, but as I neared my station, I asked in what I hoped was a casual voice, "Is your first name Bella?" He turned pale. "Yes," he answered. "How did you know?" I fumbled anxiously in my address book. "Was your wife's name Maria?" He looked as if he were about to faint. Yes, he said. I said, "Let's get off the train." I took him by the arm at the next station and led him to a phone booth. He stood there like a man in a trance while I searched for the number in my address book. It seemed hours before Maria Paskin answered. Later I learned her room was alongside the telephone, but she was in the habit of never answering it because she had so few friends, and the calls were always for someone else. This time, however, there was no one else at home, and, after letting it ring for a while, she responded. When I heard her voice at last, I told her who I was, and asked her to describe her husband. She seemed surprised at the question, but gave me a description. When I asked her where she had lived in Debrecen, and she told me the address. Asking her to hold the wire, I turned to Paskin and said, "Did you and your wife live on such and such a street?" "Yes!" Bella exclaimed. He was white as a sheet and trembling. "Try to be calm," I urged him. "Something miraculous is about to happen to you. Here, take this telephone and talk to your wife." He nodded his head in mute bewilderment, his eyes bright with tears. He took the receiver, listened a moment to his wife's voice, then suddenly cried, "This is Bella! This is Bella!" and began to mumble hysterically. Seeing that the poor fellow was so excited he couldn't talk coherently, I took the receiver from his shaking hands. "Stay where you are," I told Maria, who also sounded hysterical. "I am sending your husband to you. He will be there in a few minutes." Bella was crying like a baby and saying over and over, "It is my wife. I go to my wife." At first I thought I had better accompany Paskin lest the man should faint from excitement, but decided that this was a moment in which no stranger should intrude. Putting Paskin into a taxicab, I directed the driver to take him to Maria's address, paid the fare, and said goodbye. Bella Paskin's reunion with his wife was a moment so poignant, so electric, with suddenly released emotion, that afterward neither he nor Maria could recall much about it. I remembered only that when I left the phone, I walked to the mirror like in a dream to see if maybe my hair had turned gray. She said later, "The next thing I know, a taxi stops in front of the house, and it is my husband who comes toward me. Details I cannot remember, only this I know, that I was happy for the first time in many years. Even now it is difficult to believe that it happened. We have both suffered so much, I have almost lost the capability to not be afraid. Each time my husband goes from the house, I say to myself, will anything happen to take him from me again? Her husband is confident that no horrible misfortune will ever again befall them. Providence has brought us together, he says simply. It was meant to be. Skeptical persons would no doubt attribute the events of that memorable afternoon to mere chance. But was it chance that made Sternberger suddenly decide to visit a sick friend and hence take a subway line that he had never ridden before? Was it chance that caused the man sitting by the door of the car to rush out just as Sternberger came in? Was it chance that caused Bella Paskin to be sitting beside Sternberger, reading a Hungarian newspaper? Was it chance, or did God ride the Brooklyn subway that afternoon? The end. That was the story It Happened on the Brooklyn Subway by Paul Deutschman. Good night, everybody.